One night, a black man goes on a stroll to a quiet suburb on behalf of his girlfriend's request. As he walks down the street, a white car passes by him but quietly turns back to tail the man. At first, the man tries to ignore it, but the car makes him anxious. To stop the vehicle from following him, the man turns back and walks in the opposite direction. However, when he looks back at the car, he notices the driver isn't in the car anymore. Suddenly, a mysterious figure emerges from the dark, knocks the man out, drags his body, and abducts him. The story begins months later with a black man named Chris Washington, who works as a photographer. As Chris chills in his apartment, his girlfriend, Rose Armitage, comes to visit him. The interracial couple then discusses their plan to visit Rose's family this weekend. Rose notices that Chris is feeling nervous while packing his stuff. Then, Rose asks Chris if something is bothering him. Chris questions Rose if her parent knows she is dating a black man. Rose answers that her parents don't know it yet but assure Chris that they aren't racist and open-minded to the idea of their interracial relationship. A moment later, Chris and Rose are already on their way to visit the Armitage's residence. Chris is still nervous and wants to smoke inside the car. However, Rose snatches Chris's cigarette and throws it out of the vehicle. Chris then calls his best friend, Rod, to thank him for caring for his dog. In addition, Chris also asks Rod's opinion about him visiting a white people's residence. Rod then jokingly implies that going there isn't a good idea, but Chris quickly ends the call to avoid hearing more. After that, Chris and Rose talk about Rod, which causes her to lose her focus on driving. Suddenly, the car bumps into a deer that jumped from the bush, causing them to pull over. Soon after, a policeman comes to the scene after receiving Rose's report. As Rose and the officer settle the problem, the officer suddenly asks for Chris's ID, making the situation a bit tense. The officer expresses his prejudice toward Chris, who is a black man. Rose tries to defend her boyfriend, but Chris is seemingly used to this kind of prejudice. Chris then tries to de-escalate the situation by obeying the officer's request. After solving the problem, they continue their journey and arrive at the Armitage's residence. At Armitage's residence, Rose's parents welcome Chris with a warm welcome. Rose introduces her father, Dean, a neurosurgeon, and her mother, Missy, a hypnotherapist. Chris notices the family's overly accommodating behavior as nervous attempts to deal with their daughter's interracial relationship. After that, Dean offers to give Chris a tour around to show him. They walk around the house and talk about a thing or two as Dean introduces some stuff to Chris. Chris also gets to meet with Georgina, a black woman who works as a maid, and Walter, a black man who works as the gardener. To prevent misunderstandings, Dean explains to Chris that their family is not a type of white people who like having black servants. Dean hired Georgina and Walter to help care for Rose's grandparents, and when they die, Dean decides to keep Georgina and Walter working for their family. Dean also expressed that he is a black sympathizer to make Chris feel accepted. After that, Chris has lunch with Rose and her parents. Amidst their conversation, Rose's parents ask Chris about his parents. Chris tells them he doesn't know his father and his mother died in an accident when he was young. After telling the story, Chris's hand quivers in anxiety. Then, Dean asks Chris if he smokes, and Chris replies that he is trying to quit smoking now. Then, Rose's parents offer to help Chris quit smoking by trying Missy's hypnosis therapy. However, Chris politely refuses the offer, and Dean says they are okay with it. After that, the conversation topic changes to the get-together event. Chris and Rose are surprised to hear that it will take place this weekend, and they didn't expect that. While they are all talking about the event, Georgina comes to pour more drinks for them. Suddenly, something triggers Georgina's odd behavior which startled Chris. Missy then tells Georgina to take some rest, which she gladly obeys with an uneasy smile. Soon after, Rose's brother, Jeremy, comes home and greets them all. Later at night, Chris is having dinner with Rose's family. They talk about Rose's and Jeremy's childhood stories. When Missy goes to the kitchen to get dessert, the conversation changes to sports when Dean asks about Chris's favorite sport. Then, Jeremy asks if Chris likes fighting sports, and Chris answers that he doesn't like it. Jeremy tells Chris that with his genetic build, Chris would dominate every fight if he trained. After that, Jeremy gets up, goes to Chris, and asks him to practice a jiu-jitsu move. But before Jeremy could put his hand on Chris's neck, Missy stops him from doing it and tells him to go away. After dinner, Chris and Rose go to the bedroom to rest. Rose apologizes for her family's behavior, but Chris tells her it is okay. At midnight, Chris still feels nervous and can't sleep, so he decides to smoke and get some fresh air outside. However, when he is outside, Walter and Georgina's bizarre behavior makes him uncomfortable. When Chris is about to go back to Rose's room, he accidentally meets Missy, who reminds him of the danger of smoking. He then asks Chris to sit on the sofa for a chat. After that, Missy asks if Chris is curious about how the hypnosis she practices works. Chris jokingly answers it without realizing that every stirs of Missy's teaspoon is her hypnotic medium. Missy then asks Chris to tell her how Chris's mother died. At first, Chris is still reluctant to talk but slowly begins to talk about his painful experience. Chris recalls when his mother died while he sat at home watching TV and scratching his bed. Chris mirrors the scratching as if he was still on his memory. Suddenly, Missy tells Chris to sink, which causes his consciousness to fade and fall into a deep place. Chris's body is paralyzed on the chair as he loses control of himself. Then, Missy tells Chris he is currently inside the sunken place and slowly closes Chris's eyes. When Chris wakes up the following morning, he is already on Rose's bed and vaguely remembers what happened last night. Chris checks his phone and finds the unplugged charger but pays no attention. He plugs back the charger while reading Rod's message and then leaves to get some fresh air. This morning, Chris wanders around the residence while taking pictures. At one moment, he sees Georgina doing something weird in front of the mirror once more but decides to ignore it. After that, Chris notices Walter chopping some woods nearby and decides to approach him. When Chris casually greets Walter, he senses that Walter is acting creepy toward him just by how he talks and behaves. They then exchange some awkward interactions, which causes Chris to leave Walter alone. After meeting Walter, Chris tells Rose about his conversation with Walter and how weird Walter's behavior is. He also tells Rose that her mom had hypnotized him last night. Hearing that, Rose expresses her concern for Chris's experiences and offers to tell her dad about it, but Chris asks her not to. Soon after, Armitage's wealthy relatives and friends start to show up for the get-together event. Chris and Rose go out to greet and socialize with the guests outside. Rose introduces her boyfriend to some guests who welcome Chris back with an over-the-top demeanor. Many of the guests admire Chris's physical build and black skin, making him uncomfortable. Chris decides to take a break from socializing and instead chooses to take some pictures of the event. Chris tries to avoid anyone until he sees something that catches his attention. From afar, Chris sees another African-American man among the guests and tries to talk to him. However, Chris notices this man behaving oddly, similar to Walter. Then, the man introduces himself as Logan, the husband of a woman named Philomena. After that, Chris goes to a quieter spot and meets a blind man named Hudson, who recognizes Chris's work as a photographer. Chris also knows him as he is the owner of a famous gallery. After chatting for a while with Hudson, Chris decides to return to Rose's room. When Chris goes upstairs, all of the guests suddenly cease their conversation and bizarrely stare at Chris. In Rose's room, Chris finds his phone charger has been unplugged once again and suspects that Georgina did it. Before he could confirm it, Rose goes upstairs to find Chris. They then talk about the unplugged charger, but Rose doesn't believe it. When Rose leaves the room, Chris immediately calls Rod and informs him of all the weird things he noticed. Right after Chris ends the call, he sees Georgina at the bedroom door. She apologizes for unplugging the phone and claims she didn't mean it. Chris tells her it is okay and says he is just nervous when there are many white people around. Hearing that, Georgina starts to act bizarrely and cry with a smile, making Chris think of her as a crazy woman. Chris then goes back to the event and gets introduced to some more guests by Dean. Then, the guests start to ask some questions about being an African American. Confused by those questions, Chris then asks Logan to answer the crowd's questions. When Logan tries to answer it, Chris sneakily tries to take a picture of Logan with his phone. However, he forgot to turn off the flash, which suddenly blips on Logan's face. After the camera flashes, Logan's nose starts bleeding, and he frantically screams at Chris to get out repeatedly before Jeremy comes and subdues him. After the incident, Chris frowns upon what happened to Logan while Dean tries to tell him that Logan is having a seizure because of the flash. After spending some time in Missy's therapy room, Logan comes back to greet everyone and apologize to Chris. Logan leaves the party to rest while Chris and Rose go to the lake for private time. Somewhere quieter, Chris and Rose are arguing about what happened and all the odd things he noticed. He tells Rose that he is planning to go home by himself if she doesn't want to go with him. Meanwhile, Dean and the guests are playing a weird bingo game with Chris's picture at the front. They exchange number sheets that make it look more similar to an auction. After some time, it turns out to be Hudson who wins the game. Back to the couple, Chris reassures his feeling for Rose and asks her to go back with him. Rose reluctantly agrees with him and asks Chris to return to her house first. When they return, almost all the guests have gone home. After returning to Rose's room, Chris sends the picture of Logan to Rod. Suddenly, Rod calls Chris and informs him that he recognizes the man in the picture as Andre, not Logan. It turns out Andre is the same black man that got abducted in a quiet suburb months ago. After that revelation, Rod frantically tells Chris to leave that house now but gets cut off after Chris's phone runs out of battery. When Rose comes to the room, Chris tells her they will leave tonight. After that, Rose goes to pack her things while Chris unintentionally checks the storage closet and finds a photo of Rose with many different African American men and women. Chris is confused by this because Rose told him that he is the first African American boyfriend she has. However, Chris decides to ignore it for now, and when Rose returns to her room, Chris instructs her to go with him. When Chris and Rose walk downstairs, they meet with Jeremy, who is blocking the front door. Chris tells Rose to get the car's key from her bag, but Rose says she can't find it. The situation gets tense as Chris is surrounded by the family, who now act and talk aggressively to him. Chris can't keep his composure and starts yelling at Rose, followed by Jeremy, who begins to swing his weapon at Chris. Just then, Rose reveals that she is on her family's side. After that, Chris tries to force his way out of the house. However, Missy stirs her teaspoons, causing the hypnosis to take over Chris's consciousness. From the sunken place, he sees the Armitage family drag him away. Meanwhile, Rod tries to contact Chris several times but can't reach Chris's phone. Knowing that Andre's case is related to this, he knows that Chris is in danger. At Armitage's residence, Chris is now tied to a chair with no means of escape. Then, the TV in front of him turns on and shows a clip of Roman Armitage, the previous patriarch of the family. The clip informs Chris that their cult has selected him as the vessel for consciousness transplantation. After that, a clip of teaspoon stirring causes Chris to go back to sleep. The next time Chris wakes up, he sees Hudson on the TV. They have a bit of conversation regarding the neurosurgery that is about to happen. In the end, Hudson tells Chris to enjoy becoming a passenger while he takes over Chris's body. After that, Chris falls into desperation but notices that there are pieces of cotton on the sofa he sits on. When the teaspoon video is playing, Chris goes unconscious again. Meanwhile, Dean and Jeremy are preparing for the surgery. Dean then orders his son to get Chris's body while he cuts open Hudson's head. When Jeremy is untying Chris's body, he doesn't know that Chris has plugged his ear with the cotton to prevent him from being hypnotized. Chris hits Jeremy with a ball several times from the back. After that, Dean notices Jeremy is taking too long and decides to check the corridor. Suddenly, Chris runs full speed toward Dean and impales him with a deer trophy. When Chris reaches the front door, Chris sees Missy in her therapy room, shocked to see Chris is broken free and is still alive. They notice the teaspoon on the table and try to get it. However, Chris is faster and manages to break the teaspoon before Missy uses it. In a desperate attempt, Missy tries to stab Chris with a small knife, but Chris takes a stab at his palm without even flinching. Then, Chris overpowers her and ends her with the knife. After that, Chris reaches the door handle but is suddenly grabbed by Jeremy from behind. Whenever Chris tries to reach the door, Jeremy always prevents it with his hands or legs. Then, Chris uses all his strength to get the door handle once more. Just after Jeremy shuts it closed with his leg, Chris outsmarts him by quickly stabbing Jeremy's leg with the small knife he took from Missy. After knocking Jeremy down, Chris ends him on the spot. After that, Chris takes Jeremy's car and calls the police for help. However, Georgina jumps out of the dark and crashes onto the vehicle to stop Chris just before finishing the call. After hitting Georgina, Chris can't leave her there because he is reminded of her late mother's death in a hit and run. At the same time, Rose is upstairs with her headphone and can't hear the commotion downstairs. However, when she hears Jeremy's car outside, she realizes what's going on and decides to chase Chris with a rifle. She notices that Chris had driven away with Georgina, whom she refers to as Grandma. In the car, Georgina wakes up and attacks Chris, causing the car to stray from the road and crash. Luckily, Chris is alive, while Georgina died from the impact. When Chris is about to run, a gunshot hits the car. Rose tries to shoot Chris several times but misses her shots. She then tells Walter, whom she refers to as Grandpa, to chase and tackle Chris. At the end of the story, Walter manages to outrun Chris and strangle him on the ground. Chris reaches for the phone in his pocket and flashes its light onto Walter's eye. When Rose catches up, Walter asks Rose to hand him the gun and let him end Chris. Unbeknownst to Rose, it is not her grandpa who is in control but the actual owner of Walter's body. He then shoots Rose's chest and proceeds to end his own life. Chris then gets up to Rose, who pleads for her life by saying she truly loves him. However, Chris can't believe what Rose said anymore and strangle her. Just before Rose dies, a car with sirens comes to the scene. Chris thought it was the police, then put his hands up only to find that Rod actually came to rescue him. They leave Rose to her fate, as Chris is now free from the nightmare. What would you do if you were in Chris's situation? Write your opinion in the comment section. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like and comment to help the channel out. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.